After lunch, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The weather outside was sunny, with clouds floating slowly across the blue sky. The sun lit up the front of the building that housed the trendy cafe called Turn the Corner to Meet Love. The front door was made of light-colored wood. A guy was sitting at one of the tables drinking hot coffee. His name was Yi-Ning and he was a comic book writer. He had slicked down brown hair and brown eyes, and was wearing a white t-shirt and a blue hoodie with a zipper. Simultaneously, he was working on his laptop while waiting for a blind date. He felt that this cafe was the perfect place to do so. The cafe was decorated in a loft style. It had concrete walls combined with a wooden ceiling. Under his comic book Cultivating 365 Types of Techniques, a strange comment appeared from a user under the nickname Linger. She wrote that she was a loyal reader of Yi-Ning's works and she had something to report to him. The girl claimed that if he returned home today, he would die. She asked her not to take anyone's word for it, for they might find him too, just as she had. Yi-Ning read the comment with a slightly surprised face and didn't understand what it was written for. Linger had a completely blank profile. She had no books bookmarked, books read, books liked, donations and recommendations. Yi-Ning thought she was a weird weirdo. After all, she also had a first-level account and no titles. How could she be his loyal fan? He marveled at the fact that there were such crazy people in their day. He looked up to the top of his laptop screen. The date showed October 28th, and the time was 3:05. He had arranged to meet the girl at 3 sharp, so he figured he had already been rejected. Suddenly, the door to the cafe opened and a woman's feet in brown-colored shoes appeared. Yi-Ning sat with a bored face and thought that, as expected, a blind date didn't always work out. But he didn't despair, and mentally turned to the girls and said his hand would only start drawing faster. He figured that if he didn't finish the 2 new chapters today, his editor would turn into an angry dog. The girl who entered started to walk through the hall. She was quite tall. She had long blonde hair. She was wearing a black turtleneck with wide sleeves and a red tight miniskirt, and she had a small leather bag with her. The cafe manager greeted her. The girl turned to him and thanked him for his hospitality. She had thin eyebrows and beautiful brown eyes. Her eyelashes were thickly painted with brown mascara and her lips were lightly painted with pink lipstick. She wore gold earrings. The girl held a smartphone in her hands and headed towards the tables. Yi-Ning paid attention to her and with a dreamy face thought that she was very beautiful and wondered if she could be the one he was waiting for. He turned to his laptop again and picked up the drink in his hands. Yi-Ning thought that he shouldn't expect so much. After all, girls like this are always surrounded by rich men, and a handsome and ordinary guy like him should just draw comics. Suddenly, a stranger headed towards his table, which Yi-Ning couldn't notice. She sat down on the sofa opposite Yi-Ning and said hello to him. She asked if she could sit here. Yi-Ning was a bit taken aback, but still came to his senses and replied to her that he was waiting for someone here. And besides, he was also doing a job here that could bring in a lot of money on a daily basis. The girl faintly smiled, introduced herself with the name King Rong, and asked if his name was Yi-Ning and if he had accidentally come on a blind date. She showed her phone screen, which had a correspondence on it. In this correspondence, the girl arranged to meet someone at 3 p.m. at a cafe called Turn the Corner to Meet Love. She said if it wasn't him, she would then apologize and leave. Yi-Ning didn't show his surprise and silently looked at her, but inside he was shocked that she was really his blind date partner. He closed his laptop and said his name was really Yi-Ning. He started drinking coffee from his white mug, then told King Rong that she was amazing since she was able to find among so many people. He asked if she would like something to drink. King Rong said she was fine and didn't need anything. She smiled playfully and said she would be frank. She confessed that Yi-Ning really likes her a lot. The girl added that if Yi-Ning wants, they can go and get married right now. Such a statement made the guy choked on his coffee and spit it out, being shocked. He wiped his face from the drink and asked what she meant with incomprehension. King Rong fixed her hair, tucking it behind her ears, and asked frustratedly, "Molly, doesn't he like her?" The girl was sweating with excitement. The guy rubbed his chin thoughtfully and thought that such a beautiful girl wanted him. He decided that something must be wrong, and if it wasn't, it was just illogical. Yi-Ning held out a box of tissues to her. King Rong took it from him. Confused, he said he was satisfied with everything, but asked her if she had made this decision too quickly. The girl took out a single napkin and smilingly said being too decisive was bad, but Yi-Ning really liked her and since she was satisfied with him, why waste time? The guy lowered his gaze thoughtfully and looked at King Rong's stomach. She asked what was wrong. Yi-Ning took the coffee mug in his hands and asked if the girl was pregnant, trying to veil it. The girl leaned back on the back of the couch, put one foot on the other and put a hand on her stomach. She laughed and asked Yining, saying, did he really think he would become a father in 6 weeks? She additionally asked if she looked like she was pregnant and said she had never had a boyfriend and was a virgin. Yining was taken aback again and her answer made him choke on his drink, spitting it out. He awkwardly wiped his chin from his coffee and apologized, because he just couldn't help but ask about it. He pointed out that they still didn't know each other well and said they should get to know each other better. King Rong assumed a relaxed pose and said she was in a high position in the company. Her earnings averaged 10,000 and she had a fancy house with a car. She said if they get married, Yining can just sit at home and draw comics. She asked if Yining wanted to know anything more about her. The guy looked at her thoughtfully and started to hesitate. It all sounds too good. Does she really want to marry him? He asked King Rong why she chose him and said she is very pretty, and there must be many guys who want to marry her. The girl took Yining's coffee mug and said she chose him because he is cute. King Rong smiled friendly, sipped some coffee and asked if that was a worthy reason. Yining upsetly noticed that she was drinking his coffee. He haughtily fixed his hair and said with a narcissistic smile that he was indeed handsome, but then added that she couldn't understand a person just by appearance. Yining rubbed the back of his head and told King Rong that they could try dating for a couple of months, and then when they start to understand each other better, they would talk about getting married and asked if she was okay with that option. King Rong smiled and put her hand up in the air. She said no problem and she would do whatever he wanted. After that she suggested they eat first and then watch a movie. The guy was a little embarrassed that she had suggested it rather early and said he had expected to chat with her for longer. Yining with a blush on his face and a playful smile suggested that she sleep with him. King Rong put the mug on the table and agreed without even thinking a little longer. Yining didn't expect such a response and he thought it would scare her off. He thought that this girl was abnormal for agreeing to even something like this so quickly. Yining was quite embarrassed but decided to change the topic. He smiled and asked her name again and said he was hungry. The guy suggested to act on her suggestion and go eat first and then watch a movie. Suddenly, King Rong abruptly got up from the couch and leaned towards Yining. She playfully whispered in his ear that anything he wanted would suit her and said she had brought her passport. She continued to languorously entice him by saying that she wasn't going to go home tonight, and suggested Yining not to go home either. Yining embarrassedly apologized and said he was not the kind of person who likes to rush things. King Rong twisted a lock of her hair on her finger and said Yining is not an ordinary person, and she is fascinated by his beauty. King Rong leaned back, increasing the distance between them. The visitor behind the one next to him thought that they were filming the show, asking if people were still hooked by such a ridiculous plot. Another visitor grudgingly said he didn't want to be in the frame. Yining and King Rong got up from their table and headed for the exit, the girl taking his hand. The guy with his hands in his pockets said since King Rong took her passport, they could go to his house. King Rong replied to him that a hotel was more romantic. They went outside. It got dark pretty quickly. He asked a little cheekily what would happen if he insisted on going to his place. King Rong took his palm and, carefully ignoring the question, suggested that it would be better to go to a hotel, and said she would pay for everything and he could choose anyone he wanted. Yining grudgingly asked why he was agreeing to anything at all except letting him go home. The guy warily asked her if he would die if he went home tonight. King Rong was embarrassed and awkwardly said she didn't say such a thing. Yining remembered about that strange comment from user Linger and told King Rong to stop pretending, and if he understood correctly, those comments under his post should be written by her. He ordered her to tell him what she was up to. King Rong tensed up and lowered her eyebrows and said apparently someone had already told him that he would die if he returned home. She put her hand on her chest and firmly asked him to believe it. As for King Rong herself, according to her, she had no intention of harming Yining in any way. While they were standing under the canopy of the cafe building, lightning flashed in the sky, making a rumbling sound. A few seconds later, a downpour began to fall. Puddles formed on the road due to the rain. King Rong calmly said since Yining already knew about everything, she would tell him everything. Heavy drops were hitting the roofs of buildings and tree leaves. Lightning kept appearing in the sky along with thunder, illuminating everything with white light. King Rong told him that from tomorrow onwards, a catastrophe and great changes would come upon the world, and she, who had come from the future, was Yining's wife. The guy listened to all this with disbelief and with apprehension, but you could tell from King Rong's face that she was saying it all sincerely. The girl fixed her hair and threw it back. Yining asked with a dose of suspicion if she was a traveler who had teleported to their world. King Rong with a slightly sad expression said she was not. She had reincarnated in their world. A huge lightning bolt shone behind Yining's back, illuminating his silhouette and the buildings behind him. After this conversation, they went to the movie theater. There was a movie being shown on a wide screen, and the hall was half empty. Yining bought himself a soda from the movie bar and drank it while watching the movie, and King Rong snuggled up to him with a hug. The rain outside ended and they decided to go to a summer cafe after the movie theater. Stars began to appear in the lilac blue sky. Yining and King Rong sat on the veranda, surrounded by the dark light from the street lamps. The girl was sipping red wine with a happy face. Yining was chatting with her about something while eating snacks and drinking wine together with King Rong. They looked happy. After finishing their meal, King Rong and Yining started to pack up. A waiter approached them and called out the cost of their dinner. King Rong took out her card and repaid her dinner, not forgetting to thank the waiter. Yining only looked at them silently. He smiled slightly and said King Rong was a wonderful girl, and she didn't need his money. The couple headed towards the hotel. It was in a strict, formal style. The girl walked up to the front desk and was greeted by the receptionist. King Rong pulled out her wallet while Yining stood behind her and just watched. King Rong was talking to the receptionist about something. At this time Yining smiled quite a bit and thought that King Rong must be very rich since she could afford so many things. King Rong asked to give them one big room, to which the receptionist responded positively. Yining abruptly twitched and said they needed 2 rooms, embarrassing both King Rong and the hotel employee. The receptionist had no choice but to agree and provide 2 separate rooms. It was 8:54 p.m. on the clock. Yining took off his sweatshirt and threw his backpack beside the bed. He sprawled out on the large twin bed with his hands behind his head. The boy lay there in thought. He told himself that he wasn't a coward, it was just that King Rong was very strange. She had told him that night that disaster would strike at exactly 12 o'clock at night, and the world would change forever. She also told him at that moment that he would become the king of the world in the future. Yining imagined how he would stand in a long gemstone robe and how he would possess magic. The guy couldn't believe it. After all, how could someone who draws comic books become a king who would save the world from disaster? He thought that King Rong was crazy, so when faced with a crazy person, he could only stay away to protect himself. Yining remembered her charming smile, in which it was impossible to even discern any guile. Suddenly, the guy's phone vibrated with a notification arriving on it. Yining turned towards it and picked up the phone. On the screen was a playful message from King Rong saying that she had taken a swim. Yining tensed up and began to wait to see what would happen next. After a minute, the phone vibrated again with new notifications. He saw that King Rong had sent him an attractive picture of herself. The interested guy clicked on the photo with a little embarrassment to get a better look. It was a picture of King Rong in a mirror, where she was sitting in a robe with a glass of wine in her hand. The robe didn't cover her long and skinny legs. Yining blushed thickly and shouted who could resist seeing such a thing. He tossed his phone aside and buried his face into his pillow with the words that he needed to go to bed. For now, he needed to get over it. It was 9 o'clock at night on the clock. Yining rolled over on his back and put his hand on his chest. He decided that if there was no disaster at 12 o'clock at night, it would prove that King Rong was crazy, and then he would go to her room and sleep with her. He stopped for a second and made a confused face. The guy asked himself if he was really going to sleep with a crazy girl. Yining picked up his phone and looked at the time. It was already 11 o'clock at night. He looked at the screen and wondered why she didn't send anything else even though it had been so long. Many questions were bothering him. Could this be real? King Rong really isn't crazy. If they start now, will they make it in time? He decided not to think about it, and instead send a message to King Rong to check if she was asleep or not. Yining opened their correspondence again with the enchanting picture. Suddenly, he received a notification that he had received a message from Ling-er. Yining was surprised that she had written to him again and clicked on the notification. Ling-er wrote to him that she was already at his house and she was so happy that he didn't come here. She reminded him to choose a side and told him that he should choose a divine cultivation method. Ling-er warned that he must not choose the demonic way or Yining would die. At the end, she wrote several times about him never trusting anyone. Yining asked what cultivation was even about and said this girl read too many comics. He decided to block her by pressing this button. It was 12 o'clock at night on the clock. The alarm clock went off. Yining was sleeping peacefully in the dark room at this time. Then he abruptly opened his eyes and turned off the alarm clock without getting out of bed. Yining asked with a dissatisfied face where this promised disaster at 12 o'clock at night was and said it was a hoax as expected. He thought that fortunately he had a pure heart and didn't fall for her appearance. A system window appeared. Welcome to the new era. A notification appeared right above Yining's head and he incomprehensibly started to read it. He realized that it was the notification panel. A new system window appeared. As you noticed, the clock has passed 12 at night. People all over the world have one choice for life. Yining was embarrassed and rolled his eyes in shock. He felt like he was in a dream. Several new system windows appeared. There are many advantages in this world, but there are also many dangers. Having a brilliant life or death, you can only rely on yourself. Yining was confused and didn't understand what the system windows that appeared one after another were talking about. A new system window appeared. Choose your cultivation type, divine or demonic. His face looked worried and scared. He realized that this crazy King Rong was right and she had been telling the truth all this time. Yining started to hurriedly get dressed, grabbing his sweatshirt. He thought about the disaster that had fallen on them. The new era had begun in the divine and demonic cultivation. He thought that Ling and King Rong had both reincarnated. Yining jogged towards the exit with thoughts that he must find King Rong as soon as possible. He was about to pull the door handle, but he suddenly stopped. He shook his head from side to side and realized that he had to think about which side to choose first. His face was very thoughtful and confused. The system window with choices appeared in front of his face again. Yining thought about which way to choose after all. In the long and empty corridor of the hotel, an ominous atmosphere hovered and someone's footsteps were heard. Yining became nervous and froze in place, but tried to reassure himself that it was King Rong coming towards him. He immediately dismissed the thought because of the realization that he was now living in a different world and he could no longer be uncautious. To stay safe, he must check everything first. Yining quietly walked to the door and looked through the door peephole. There was no one outside the door. Yining was about to move away from the peephole, thinking that everything was clear, when suddenly an intimidating and sinister figure of a feather-clad woman with black hair appeared right in front of the door. She was looking menacingly through the peephole and smiling. From surprise, the boy shrieked and backed away. He clenched his teeth anxiously and furrowed his brows, thinking that he had just seen a ghost. Yining kept quiet and listened closely. There was no sound or noise. Suddenly, people started banging on the door, trying to break it down. Yining was terrified. He didn't understand what was happening and wondered if there were any people left alive. Chips started flying from the door and the door itself cracked in several places. Yining began to beg for help, screaming with all his might. Cold sweat was running down his face. He didn't know what he should do now. As he tried to move further away from the door, he stumbled on the corner of the bed, causing him to fall to the floor. At that moment, the door finally broke. There was dust everywhere, shards of the door lying all over the floor. The monster's sinister smile appeared out of the darkness. Yining tried to roll over and stand up while a monstrous woman covered in black feathers was heading towards him. It was a harpy. Yining looked in her direction. She kept smiling, causing a primal fear. She had long fangs and sharp claws on her hands which she pulled towards Yining. The monster was almost twice the size of the guy. Yining couldn't move from his seat in fear as the monstrous woman towered over him and pulled her claws towards him. He froze, realizing that the world had already started to change and he could die right now. The black harpy was about to attack the guy, taking his life, but suddenly King Rong, dressed in a battle suit and cape, jumped onto the balcony. She had sharp metal daggers in her hands. She threw one of them, shattering the glass in the room. The sharp dagger hit right in the middle of the harpy's chest, making her bleed and the monstrous woman squeal. From the shards of glass lying on the floor, King Rong herself entered the room. She looked belligerent and brave. The girl threateningly told the harpy that as long as she was here, she would not allow her husband to be harmed. Her costume was made of black latex and encased her entire body. Yining raised his head in surprise upon seeing the girl. The harpy howled even harder and channeled all her strength into attacking King Rong. She scattered, thrusting her claws forward. Yining shouted to King Rong to be more careful. The girl hesitated for a second, making a confused face, but even that second was enough for the harpy to attack King Rong. She was thrown aside by Yining. The girl fell on her back with a thunderous crash. She cried out loudly in pain. King Rong dropped the dagger from her hands and it fell to the floor. Shocked and confused, Yining called out her name, then pulled her to him. There was a thin trickle of blood coming out of King Rong's mouth. She didn't react to Yining's words at first, but then came to her senses. The girl pressed herself against the guy's chest and put her hand on it. She said it was okay. After all, she had promised to protect him. But this thing was too strong and King Rong needed Yining's help. She raised her gaze to him and gave him a pitiful look, calling him her favorite. She asked to choose Yining's demonic path, so that together they could kill the harpy. Yining agreed at first, but then realized what she said about the demonic path. King Rong started to stand up, raising his knife. He wondered if the demonic path was the strongest, remembering that system window with the choice. King Rong stood between him and the harpy, trying to restrain her as the monstrous woman prepared to attack again. She told him to choose the demonic path and asked him to believe her since she was his future wife and wouldn't lie to Yining. He remembered Ling Er's last message, then exhaled and said King Rong's words were very convincing. Yining, sitting on the floor, said he understood what King Rong was talking about. He was drawing comics and in them, the development speed of the demonic path is much faster than the divine path. King Rong looked at him contentedly, smiled and said this was the future king's answer, because he was able to make such an accurate analysis at such a moment. Yining told her to turn around, for at this moment, a harpy was attacking her. King Rong instantly reacted and jumped back to the other side, preventing the harpy from harming her, then kicked the monster in the head with her foot from the turn. The harpy's mouth bled and it was furious. The harpy got up from the floor and started attacking King Rong again. The girl told Yining to choose the demonic path faster, for she could no longer restrain the monster. Sweat was running down her face. She was tense and focused on the battle. King Rong said the demonic path is the foundation of this world, and when she and Yining unite, no one in this world will be able to match them. The harpy and the girl clashed. King Rong tried to hold the harpy's claws with her hands so that they wouldn't stab into her neck. Yining started to get up from the floor and said it was good that she reminded him of this, otherwise he would have really chosen the divine path. He thanked her, calling her his wife, and said he loved her very much. Yining approached King Rong from the back and pulled his hands to her chest while she tried to hold the harpy. When Yining almost touched her chest, the girl turned around and swung her arm, cursing at him. He was ready for it and so he bounced back, avoiding the attack. He smirked and said as expected, King Rong couldn't be trusted and if she was really his wife, she would let him do what he would want. He asked if King Rong really thought he was stupid. Yining stretched his hands forward and pushed her away from him, then started to run away as fast as he could. He said goodbye to her, sarcastically calling her his favorite wife. The harpy almost reached King Rong, but she managed to jump back at the last moment and run away in the other direction. She begged Yining not to leave, but it was too late. The harpy opened its mouth wide and howled, its eyes glowing green. King Rong grabbed her daggers and with an angry face, she shouted at the harpy that she would not interfere with her and ordered her to get out of the way. She stabbed the harpy several times in a second in cold blood, causing it to fall to the ground at King Rong's feet. The girl stood up proudly with her hand on her hip and said she and Yining would see each other again. At this time, Yining was desperately running through the corridors of the hotel looking for an exit. He turned a corner and saw a huge crowd who were also trying to escape from the place. They were asking why there was no elevator, asking him not to push, because if the monster appeared, they would all die here. Screams from the crowd echoed through the corridors now and then. They were asking to disperse to the sides. Some were begging God for mercy and escape from this place. Yining realized that the elevator and both staircases were packed with people and there was no way to escape through them. He looked at the window and realized that there was no other way but to jump out of it. Yining began to carefully climb out of the window, trying to find support in the form of air conditioners on the brick wall of the hotel. Several system windows appeared. The evolution of the new world was starting. The rate of plant evolution was changed. It was increased by 100 times. The mutation rate was increased. Yining climbed up to the drain, then grabbed onto it with his hands and feet and started to climb down it. He ended up in some alleyway, from which he immediately started running away. Several new system windows appeared. Activate space. Activating. System forum. Activating. Someone from the street shouted that there was a monster walking around and shouted for people to escape as soon as possible. A sinister silhouette with red glowing eyes resembling a wolf's head emerged from the darkness and fog of the alley. It was a werewolf that was twice the size of Yining. It had a collar with chains around its neck and growled threateningly at Yining. The guy was dumbfounded and confused. These monsters had appeared too suddenly and he was lucky that he had only met two in all this time. The werewolf opened its huge maw and screamed, splashing saliva. Yining saw a trash can nearby and grabbed it. He swung it around and shouted to the monster that he wasn't afraid of it. The guy threw the trash can at the enraged monster with all his might as it ran towards him down the narrow alley. When the trash can almost reached the monster, he tore it to pieces right in the air with his claws. While the werewolf was coping with the trash, Yining started to run away in the other direction, frightened. He realized that this creature's danger level was simply amazing for someone he could just run into on the street. Yining ran towards the dumpster while the werewolf tried to catch up with him. All the guy could think of was to run faster. He managed to escape safely, leaving the werewolf behind. The monster returned closer to the hotel Yining had escaped from. It fiercely tried to pounce on King Rong, but she was able to defend herself with her blades, decapitating the werewolf in cold blood. King Rong stood near the wall, looked up at the sky and thought about where Yining might have fled to. She took out a notebook from her cape, on which was the address of Yining's house, Tian Street, North Coastal District 139, Building 3, Floor 16, Room 302. She believed that normal people would rush home first in such a situation despite knowing the danger. King Rong stepped away from the hotel and walked over the dead body of the werewolf. She looked at the night sky and promised to find Yining. At this time, he was running down the main street, out of breath, and thought about the fact that if King Rong couldn't be trusted, then he would bet on Ling Er. Yining was tense and anxious. He had to find Ling Er. She should be at his house. While he was running, a system window with forum posts appeared in front of his face. A user under the nickname Iron Fist Lai San Lang wrote that he had just risked his life to finish off some monster, and at that time he suddenly awakened some superpower called Fire Elemental. He said his fists actually caught fire. A user under the nickname Maba asked how this could really happen and asked his boss to save him. A user under the nickname Sweet and Lovely begged for someone to help her, as she is now on the roof of a high-rise and is afraid to leave this place. A user under the nickname One Punch Beefsteak wrote that the monster ate him halfway, and he was almost dead, and before he died he had to confess his love to some girl. Yining didn't realize at first what kind of correspondence was in front of his face. It still seemed to him that the monster appeared randomly, which meant that nowhere was safe, one had to escape or he would die. He remembered the message of the man who had suddenly awakened some superpower in him. Yining tensed up and realized that he had to kill monsters if he wanted to survive, but first he had to choose his path. The system window with the choice of cultivation method appeared in front of him again. He thought about the fact that divine and demonic cultivation didn't have any tie to factions and it was just a class system. He decided that it was like choosing between being a fighter or a mage. Yining decided that enough thinking, and if the demonic path was wrong, then he should choose divine cultivation. He clicked on that button in the system window, and then a new system window appeared. You have successfully chosen the cultivation path. Congratulations, you have obtained the Kai maintenance formula. Yining was embarrassed and confused. He thought that he had apparently gotten everything right, but he didn't understand what a Kai maintenance formula was and if this was even the time to procrastinate. He would ask for something like Divine Flight or 18 Palms Conquering Dragons to be better given to him. Yining remembered what King Rong had told him about becoming a king one day, and he thought that he would be given some cheater special skill. Yining continued to run along the street without stopping. The surroundings were empty. He didn't even encounter any other people or monsters. A system window appeared. Class selection confirmed. The interface elements were loading. After that, his profile appeared, and some stats were listed there, such as tool refining talent, healing talent, martial arts affinity, body structure, mental potential, physical potential, and swordsmanship. All of the stats were rated perfect. They were all at the 100% mark. Yining read all of this carefully, and thought that he had lived a rather quiet, flawless life and he couldn't stand it when someone cheated. He stopped running, and with a happy face raised his index finger up and said if there was an opportunity to cheat, why not? Suddenly he stopped smiling and noticed something in the sky. His face looked confused. A wing flapped in the sky and behind the wing a claw of a bird appeared. A proud bird flew through the night sky by the light of the stars and moon. It had red feathers that fell down to the ground with every flap of its wings. Yining gazed at the bird for a while. He couldn't understand where he had seen this new age creature before. He remembered drawing in his office on his graphics tablet, being terribly tired and sleep deprived. Yining suddenly realized that it was then that he had drawn a mythical bird called a red-tailed hawk with 4 legs. He also realized that the harpy that attacked him in the hotel room and the werewolf called a kobold hunter with chains around its neck were characters he had made up. Yining wondered if it could be that the new age creatures were the monster from his comic book. Suddenly, a mysterious figure appeared from the corner. It turned out to be a ferocious werewolf. It jumped over Yining and landed on one knee. The terrifying monster immediately started snarling at him, glaring at the guy with its red wild eyes. The werewolf had saliva dripping from its mouth, the dim light making its face even more sinister. The monster said Yining was finally caught and asked if the guy was still going to run. Yining was dumbfounded and froze in place with terror. It seemed to him that this was the end, and even with such marvelous new age royal skills, his life could end right here. He calmed down a bit, putting his panic to the back of his mind. He decided he wasn't going to give up that easily, and while he had no idea why the monsters from his comic book were appearing, if that monster standing across from him was really a kobold hunter then he had to try something. The guy noticed he was standing next to a fashion boutique. He turned towards it and saw something. He abruptly ran into the broken doors of the clothing store and thought to himself that given his description to these monsters, whether kobolds or girl cats, their behavior isn't much different because of their origins, and basically they both came from street cats and dogs in this world. Thus there is nothing they fear more than being locked in a cage. Accordingly, getting into a confined space should make them claustrophobic. Yining started running through the rooms and corridors of the store. He reached the fitting booths, grabbed the door of one of them and opened it ajar. The ferocious werewolf scattered clothes around looking for his prey. He clenched his sharp claws and said the guy wasn't running anywhere. The monster noticed that among the closed stall doors there was one that was slightly ajar. Without even thinking, he rushed forward and flew into that stall. He began to look around, growling threateningly, saliva pack on the floor on which items of clothing lay. Suddenly, Yining jumped out of the next stall overhead and instantly covered the uncomprehending werewolf with a large blue shirt. The monster began to tangle in the shirt, unable to see anything. Yining began to get the werewolf's attention, urging it to come up to him and catch him. The confused werewolf paid no attention to his words. All he could think about was getting out of the trap. Yining realized that his ploy had worked. Just as he thought, the small confined space would make him forget about him, and with the only thought of getting out in his mind, he would recklessly rush out. The enraged kobold would hit the walls of the stall, trying to get out and throw off his shirt. Yining kept provoking him to see if it really worked. He took one last look at him before running out of there. He thinks this is what they call waiting for the dog under the tree. Yining realized that this was his chance while the monster was busy trying to free himself. He grabbed a piece of concrete lying on the floor and swung with all his might, aiming straight at the monster. The hit to the head instantly caused the monster to lose consciousness, after which it died. The stone hitting its head caused a bright glow everywhere, emanating from the werewolf's body. Yining, still holding the piece of concrete in his hand, stood amidst the expensive clothes and looked at the breathless body of the werewolf, happy that he had finally done it. The guy was breathing heavily after the short fight, not noticing nothing around him. There was a small girl with fox-like ears lurking under a shelf of accessories. Yining noticed a strange noise behind him, so he instantly turned around, looking at the unknown creature, and thinking that it would pounce on him again and try to kill him. Suddenly, instead of attacking the guy, the fox girl hugged his leg, clawing at him. Yining, not understanding anything, looked at her, wondering what was even going on. The little girl smiled radiantly, covered in blush, and called Yining daddy, saying that she had been waiting for him for so long. She had shoulder-length blonde hair, big white fluffy ears, and 2 white tails behind her back. The girl was dressed in a pink blouse with denim overalls. As the girl continued to hug Yining's leg tightly, he perplexedly asked what kind of daddy he was to her. He tried to gently back away, causing the girl to put him down. She looked at him questioningly, lifting her head up. Yining squatted down and unhappily shoved her away from him as she tried to return to him. He said the girl appeared to be mistaken, as he was not her father. While Yining held her shoulder, preventing her from snuggling up to him again, she looked at him with sad eyes full of resentment and said her mom asked her to wait here, and the first man to come here is her dad. It was as if she was holding back tears as she said this. The confused Yining looked at the girl, still trying to keep her from hugging her, and asked, saying, "Do they look alike since she is a fox?" He said he had no ears and was tailless and asked how could they be related then. The fox girl trembled and began to cry bitterly. Yining became confused and stopped holding her, removing his hands. She, whimpering and sobbing, said her mom looked just like Yining, calling him daddy. According to her, she didn't have a tail and ears either. Yining thought for a second that if her mom didn't have them either, then she is a human. He looked excitedly at the unfortunate girl who was sobbing at his feet and asked how a human could be born a demon and clarified the girl's name. She raised her head and said with tears in her eyes that her name was Da Jai. Yining was taken aback and pictured in his mind a graceful yet dangerous noble white fox that had white fur and 9 tails. She was a demon queen who was also named Da Jai. Little Da Jai pounced on his neck, hugging him tightly with her arms and legs. Yining was surprised and thought about people awakening special powers after killing monsters like that guy from the forum under the nickname Iron Fist. But he met a demon queen. The girl's name was Da Jai, like that big demon fox from the comics. But she's just a little kid and the girl looks very weak. Da Jai, while hugging him, kept crying and sobbing loudly. Suddenly, she started shaking him by his hood, saying that she remembered something. Her mom had given her a message, which was that if dad came, he needed to give her a present. Yining looked at her uncomprehendingly and asked what other gift. Da Jai, sitting on his lap, pointed to a door at the other end of the room and said the present was lying there. They opened the door together and saw a storage room with boxes, various pallets, and a suitcase with a large lock in the middle. Yining looked at the suitcase with the gold lock and said there was probably a present inside. He held Da-Jai's hands and asked her if her mom had told her what was inside. The girl looked up at him and replied that her mom didn't tell her anything, but she sees a doll inside. Yining awkwardly scratched his cheek and asked if she could really see what was inside the suitcase. Da-Jai smiled at him and pointed her finger at the nearby boxes, then said she could see the contents of not only the suitcase, but also the other boxes inside this room. Yining was surprised and thought that she had superhuman vision. He sat down with her and asked her to tell him what she sees next to this room, what else she can see. She stomped her feet and frustratedly said she couldn't see anything else. Da-Jai said if she needed to, she could see everything, all the way to some big house that she was pointing in the direction of. She could see absolutely everything, including stores, buildings, enemy locations, and so on. Yining looked at her a little anxiously, remembering that house was 100 meters away. Then he thought that Da-Jai could be his navigator. Yining decided that he needed to see what was in the gift box. He grabbed the first boulder he could find and hit the lock, which broke. Da-Jai and Yining looked at the contents of the box with surprise. Above the various jars and small boxes was a pink-colored paper doll. Da-Jai happily grabbed it and started spinning around the room with it, shouting happily that she was right and it was indeed a paper doll. Yining anxiously told her to put the doll back down. Da-Jai looked at him frustratedly. Holding the doll above her head, she asked, saying, "Isn't she for Daddy?" Suddenly, an ominous green aura appeared next to the doll, after which it burst into pieces and disappeared. Da-Jai didn't realize what had happened, looking at the pieces of paper in surprise. She looked at her hands, as if holding back tears, and asked Yining if the doll had disappeared. He decided to make fun of her a little by saying that Da-Jai had broken the present meant for Daddy and called her bad. The girl immediately started sobbing, trembling with fear and guilt. Yining decided not to torture her, after which he stroked her gently on the head and told her that it was fine. After all, it was just a toy. He looked at her hand Da-Jai confusedly and asked what happened to her. Da-Jai, still with tears in her eyes, looked at it in surprise and saw that her left hand showed a doll, exactly like the one from the box. The girl twitched her hand in the other direction out of fear, squeezing her eyes shut, whereupon the image of the doll, surrounded by green light, appeared on one of the many wooden boxes. Da-Jai stood on her tiptoes and looked at the image of the doll in surprise, wondering why it was on the box. Suddenly, the doll began to peel off the box, whereupon it jumped to the floor. Little Da-Jai stared in amazement at the doll that had come to life, opening her mouth in surprise and getting on all fours. She started tugging Yining by the sleeve of his sweatshirt, pointing her finger at the paper doll, after which she asked what happened to it. The pink doll waved its hand at them. Yining realized that this doll was from his comic book 365 Techniques. It even had its name there. He pictured in his mind a monstrous creature that was made up of different papers. It was red and green in color. It was called the demonic origami technique. Yining perplexedly looked at the puppet, raising one eyebrow upwards. Da-Jai took the doll by the hand and started humming and dancing, saying that this doll was funny and suggested Yining to play with it too. Yining at this time was wondering if this little girl could gain skills. He squatted down, took her by her armpits, thus stopping her from dancing, and asked Da-Jai about where her mom had gone. The girl at this time looked at him with a slightly confused look, continuing to hold the doll's hand. Da-Jai said her mom had killed 2 of the monster dogs and kicked the 3rd one outside. She remembered what it looked like, a girl with long hair fighting a 3-meter monster, protecting herself and the girl. After a while, Da-Jai said her mom killed one and she let her kill the other one. At this time, Yining realized that she could indeed gain skills. The guy put his hands on the girl's shoulders and asked if mom said anything else before running away. Da-Jai replied in a quiet voice that mommy said to wait for daddy, and that daddy would come here specifically. Yining was taken aback. He felt as if he had been electrocuted by the realization that she knew about this. He decided that it was all unimportant. After all, what mattered was that Da-Jai was a threat to him. Yining took the girl by her armpits and lifted her high up. Da-Jai was very happy about this and started laughing, smiling and waving her arms, thus dropping the paper doll on the floor. Yining thought that perhaps everything would become clear after he returned home and found Ling-er. Yining put the girl on his shoulders, holding her with his hands, telling Da-Jai that her daddy would carry her on his back. The girl was very excited. She raised one arm in the air and held onto Yining's head with the other hand. There was still not a soul on the street lamps were not lit, and only the moonlight illuminated their way. Yining and Da Jai at his neck were walking along the street. Yining asked her where there were no big red dots on the map. After all, they signified enemy creatures. Da Jai visualized a small diagram in her head that showed all the main locations. She replied that there were 2 dots in the front, but there were no dots on the left. Yining turned where she said. Da Jai then praised him for going right, then pointed to the right and told him to go there. After turning right, the girl pointed her finger and said to turn left here. They passed by a grocery store and trees. After a while, the girl complainingly asked when they would get there. In front of them was a view of an apartment complex entranceway with a neat lawn and glass doors. They approached the multi-story building where Yining lived. He answered the girl that they had already arrived. After the new era, the city was plunged into chaos. Buildings were burning everywhere, sparks flew to the ground, and the roofs of buildings were smoking. Terrible screams could be heard from everywhere. The people were being chased by 2 werewolves plunged into madness. One girl was already slumped on the ground and the monster was about to eat her. The second girl was tearfully trying to hold on to her boyfriend, who was desperately running as far away as possible. Cries for mercy and cries for help could be heard from everywhere. The whole city was in flames, people were in danger, everyone was trying to escape from this nightmare. Yining and Da Jai, who was sitting on his back, looked at the house he lived in. There was a thick column of smoke coming from some of the windows. People were screaming and asking for help now and then. Yining is lucky to have a live card. Not only is she cute, but she's also reliable. With her, he can avoid monsters. Yining turned his head back, telling her that they had arrived at their destination. Dashi at this time grabbed his shoulders tightly and looked at the multi-story house in amazement, and it was like she was glowing with happiness. 2 guys came out of the door of the house. The first one had a potty haircut, wore glasses and a shirt and tie. He was quite tall and very thin, and he was holding a machete. Next to him walked his friend. He was shorter than him by about a head and was quite fat. He had dark short hair that was disheveled on the sides. He wore a red polo and was holding a metal pipe. The tall guy told his friend that someone was coming this way. His friend answered him with a question, asking if the person was coming toward them. The 2 of them looked at Yining, who was approaching them. The guy with glasses told his fat friend that it appeared to be the fool from apartment 302. He also pointed out that there was someone walking along with him. The fat guy was surprised and said it was the fox girl. They walked closer to the guy. Yining realized that these 2 lived with him on the same floor as him. Da Jai looked at them in amazement but remained silent. The guy with glasses asked Yining, calling him brother, where he got this fox from. They smiled sinisterly, and the fat guy, twirling a metal pipe in his hands, asked him to tell them where they could get such a demonic spirit as a pet. He also said they could then become bros and they would help each other in the future if needed. Yining asked them which cultivation method they chose, demonic or divine. He said if they chose demonic, there was an old man wandering around outside who was handing out quests, and if they completed his quest, they would get themselves a pet. He had a calm face and Da Jai listened to him with interest silently. The skinny guy corrected his white glasses and asked if there were really such quests. The fat guy in polo told Yining that it was very dangerous here and offered him to go with them. Yining asked to let him pass and walked past them. He smiled slyly and said he would go with them, only he had to go home and get something, assuring them that it would be very quick and he would have 5 minutes to do it. Calling the guys bros. They looked at him incomprehensibly, seeing him off while Da Jai looked at them incredulously and suspiciously. One of them grabbed Yining by the shoulder and ordered him to wait. The guy glanced worriedly at his arm, and Da Jai clutched tighter into Yining's sweater out of fear. The guy with glasses asked with a displeased face how they would realize that Yining wasn't lying to them. He suggested that he leave the fox girl with them while he went up to his house. The fat friend supported him and ordered him to leave the fox girl here as well. Yining laughed awkwardly and asked if they wanted to be his bros, then said if they wanted to be bros, they should have mutual trust in each other. Da Jai made an angry face at this time and said to go home as quickly as possible. The guy fixed his glasses and said in that case, they should all go up together. His friend said if anything, they would help him with something at his house, like taking some things. Yining started walking towards the entranceway and thanked the guys. Da Jai tapped him on the shoulder and told him to leave faster. Yining realized that as the new era began, the dark side of people began to show itself more and more. They entered the house and started to take the stairs as it would not be safe to take the elevator at this time. Speaking of the pet, Yining didn't mention the demonic path for nothing. They looked satisfied, which meant it was their way. Yining's neighbors were walking behind, while the guy himself was walking in front. Da Jai asked why they still haven't reached and hurried him. There is a pungent smell of blood on the floor. They probably have already gotten their abilities. They reached Yining's apartment number 302. Yining started to open the front door, taking Da Jai off his shoulders. A fat guy stood next to him, making sure everything was clean. The guy with glasses stood a little farther away from them. If one thought about it that way, Linger should still be in his apartment. Apparently, she had reincarnated too after all. Yining wondered how strong she was. Da Jai had a happy face. She waved at Yining and asked if this was his house. He awkwardly smiled and answered positively, while simultaneously typing in the code for the lock on the door. He had to deal with what was inside first. The front door opened. He abruptly grabbed Da Jai's hand and flashed into his apartment with her, leaving his persistent neighbors in shock. Yining tried to slam the front door shut before they could enter, but the fat guy managed to slip his metal pipe through the small gap. Da Jai was thrilled to see her, what she thought, Daddy's apartment. The fat guy started to move the pipe to open the door wider, then poked his head through the doorway. He smiled evilly and said Yining was being very rude to his bros. Yining himself fake laughed with his eyes squeezed shut and his eyebrows furrowed, and said it was a habit to slam the door behind him. He let the boys into his place, turned on the light in the living room, and offered to make themselves as comfortable as they liked. He has a small, bright apartment. There was a white carpet and a couch in the living room, a notebook with a pen and a vase of flowers on the coffee table. He had a large TV with a humidifier on the floor next to it. Da Jai ran around his apartment with an amazed expression on her face. She first grabbed his portable game console, examining it, before running into the kitchen. A guy wearing glasses came over to his shelf with various detailed figures and asked if he was rich since he had so many figures. Yining scratched his head and smiled. He said he just draws comics. He suggested they look at everything while he went to the other room to get the item he needed. The fat guy turned to him and said they would wait for him here for now. Then he started to look at the figure of a girl in a revealing bunny costume. Yining opened the curtains to see if there was anyone on the balcony, after which he looked under the bed and then opened the closet with his clothes. He looked at the shelf beside his bed, scratched the back of his head and started to wonder where Linger was. She said she was at his house, but where did she go? Da Jai at this time was running from corner to corner, looking and touching everything that was interesting to her, and then she started to climb up on the bed. A mysterious blue light spilled onto the bed. It pointed to a leaf lying there. The girl immediately calmed down and began to quietly observe. Yining noticed this light and turned around to see what it was pointing at. He realized it was a note and started reading it. It was written by Linger for Yining. The letter said if he survived and was able to return home, Linger congratulated him and he could now add him as a friend. Her ID, 303,003. At the end she wrote that she was waiting for him. Da Jai started jumping up and down trying to reach the letter, saying that she wanted to read it too. Yining was upset that this loyal fan didn't even leave him a weapon. A system window opened in front of the guy. Da Jai hung on the guy's arm and was very surprised by the window. The system window said, ID 303,003, do you wish to send a friendship request? Yining clicked the add button. He walked out of the room while holding Da Jai's hand. He smiled at the guys and suggested that they start moving out and take a couple missions. The guys smiled wickedly and the neighbor with glasses asked Yining what ability he had gotten. The fatty said since they all chose the demonic path, they had nothing to hide from each other. Da Jai, holding Yining's hand, looked at him with a puppy dog look and said Yining had said on the way home that he would train in the divine path, and asked if that was true. The guy with glasses became furious and questioned if that was the case, and his fat friend shouted angrily why this girl said he had chosen the divine path. Yining felt as if he had died inside. He couldn't even think that this girl would be able to set him up so badly and throw him into danger. At this time, Da Jai tugged his sleeve and asked him what was wrong. Yining started to heal, backing away, and the girl asked what he was up to. He told the disgruntled guys that he wouldn't believe some talking pet if he were them, and that he had quarreled with his wife after all and he was actually a cultivator of the demonic path. The guy with glasses smiled vilely and said if that was true, then let him show what he gained by choosing the demonic path. His friend said if he didn't show, they would take away his pet. Yining reached the back of the window and there was nowhere else to go. He pressed himself against the window and realized there was nowhere to run and asked himself if he could survive if he jumped from here. At this time, the outline of King Rong could be seen on the balcony. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of him with a ringing sound. Your friend request has been accepted. You have received a message. It was a message from Linger. She made sure he was alive and was happy about it. He was pleasantly surprised by this, because now he could contact Linger, and now he could only survive because of her. Yining sent a message saying that two demonic cultivators were trying to attack her favorite author. He asked to teach him something, attacking rather, noting that it was very urgent. He sent a message and waited. King Rong smiled and whispered something to Yining while standing on the balcony. King Rong broke the glass by hitting him with her knee and jumped into the room. Yining and Da Jai squeezed their eyes shut and turned away so the shards wouldn't hit them. Yining sarcastically remarked that it was as if he had seen this somewhere before. King Rong looked at Yining, smiled and waved at him. Her smile looked very mysterious. She said they hadn't seen each other for only a few hours and Yining had already picked someone up. And with this, he upset King Rong a lot. The guy with glasses opened his mouth wide in surprise, and his fat friend blushed a little and said she was a beauty. Yining blocked Da Jai with his body while she was unhappily swearing at King Rong. The guy asked the girl what she was doing here. King Rong laughed lightly, scratched the top of her head, put her hand on her hip and said she came for Yining. The wind from the broken window started blowing across the room. A draft formed. The wind began to flutter King Rong's hair and cloak. She stood in an attractive pose, looked at Yining over her left shoulder, smiled playfully and said he was her husband after all. Suddenly someone handed the girl his phone, at the screen of which there was a QR code. The girl was surprised and looked at the one who was holding out the phone to her. It was a fat neighbor. He blushed thickly and looked at King Rong with loving eyes. He called her mistress and asked if she could add her as a friend. King Rong didn't like this very much, so she swung her left leg with all her might and hit the poor guy's face with it. Blood spurted out of his mouth and then he dropped his phone from his hands. King Rong hit him so hard that the poor guy flew to the other end of the room, hitting his head on the bookshelf in Yining's bedroom. His friend with glasses stared at King Rong stunned, not realizing what had just happened. King Rong turned around angrily and looked at her victim. She looked at him with a hate-filled look and told him that he was scaring her, insultingly called him ugly and fat and ordered him not to come near her anymore. The guy with glasses ran up to his friend, lifted him slightly behind his back and asked if he was okay. King Rong at this time looked at the two of them with a judgmental look, pulling something out of his cloak. Yining looked at this whole situation confusedly, not realizing what had happened. Da Jai hid behind him, clutched onto his leg and glared angrily at the guys. The fat guy was covered in bruises and abrasions. Then he suddenly smiled and told his bro that this woman was very hot and liked him. His friend with glasses told him that he was just a fool, but he had superpowers. He asked if he had seen the Apocalypse comic. Because if you had powers, all the beauties would be yours. He pictured in his head the main character of such a comic book, who was surrounded by cute and attractive women in bunny suits. The guy with glasses then shouted to his friend that he had enough rest and ordered him to get up. The fat guy started to stand up and said his bro was right, but this woman would belong to him. The guy with glasses took his machete in his right hand and started walking towards King Rong, saying that he will attack first. King Rong smugly looked at them with her finger and sarcastically said they could attack together, because it would be more fun. A bell-like sound could be heard in the room. A dialogue box appeared in front of Yining's face. You have received a message, sender Ling-er. Yining looked towards King Rong, thinking that she couldn't see the chat. Apparently, the private information panel is only visible to the owner. Ling-er wrote to him, treating him as a dear author, and sent him a file with a technique file that he could use to quickly disperse the demonic path cultivators. There was one file attached, Sword Technique 1 Form. Yining was surprised and thought that this was a very useful system. He looked at the system window in amazement and said this was the best internet, because an entire technique could be directly sent to any user through it. He wondered, when studying it, whether it would be useful. Yining clicked on the Open File button. The 10,000 Swords technique opened up in front of him, showing a man taking various battle stances with constellations in his hands. Yining scrutinized this technique and thought, if the first form was 10,000 swords, what would the second form be like? A new system window appeared. Talent, learning martial arts 100%. Progress of learning sword technique 10%. The process gradually progressed, reaching 70% in a matter of seconds. Yining swept his eyes over the fact that everything was happening so fast. Several new system windows appeared. Technique learning progress has reached 100%. You have successfully obtained the first form of sword technique, 10,000 swords. He raised his head in astonishment, frozen with surprise, and thought that this cheat was just great. The fat guy started to be covered in a green aura and attracted King Rong's attention. He got into a fighting stance. A green mantis appeared behind his back. This technique was called Mantis Imitation. The guy told her that he had good abilities, however, didn't bother to listen to him and kicked him again from a U-turn, but now in the stomach. The fat man's mouth bled and he started coughing and choking. King Rong began to mock him, saying that he had no good abilities. The guy with glasses worriedly called out to his friend, who was lying on the floor with no strength. The fat man told him that this time he really couldn't get to his feet. The guy with glasses grabbed his machete tighter, whereupon he bent down where the blade was coming from. He was covered in a purple aura, and an equally purple buffalo appeared behind his back. Veins appeared all over the guy's body, and he said it was his special rank C ability. King Rong stood in a fighting stance, bending one leg and placing her arms at her sides. Behind her, a proud red bird appeared and spread its wings the same way. King Rong sarcastically remarked that it only had a C rank. She took a step forward before leaping into the air, doing a somersault. The guy with glasses seemed to freeze in place, being unable to step aside and avoid the attack. King Rong straightened up in the air and channeled all her power into her legs, hitting the poor guy's face with her thick heels, trampling him into the ground. Only his head was sticking out of the floor. His glasses fell off and he said she was really hot. King Rong turned to Yining, fixed her hair and took a seductive pose. She asked him if she was amazing. Da-Jai pressed herself against Yining's leg and worriedly said this woman is not her mom. He said he knew that, then stood in front of her and ordered her to stand behind her, calling her by name. She agreed and began to wait. King Rong tensed up and said Yining now had a spiritual fox. Yining started to be covered in a blue aura and said he didn't care who this King Rong was. He had already chosen the divine path, which meant that they couldn't be together. He stood in a fighting stance, bending his knees slightly and raising one arm above his head. A multitude of green swords appeared around him and pointed towards King Rong. He shouted that King Rong would be in trouble now, then pointed all these magical blades towards the stunned King Rong, who didn't understand how he did it. The swords began to strike her, throwing the girl backwards, breaking the wall. Suddenly, there was an explosion, causing concrete slabs to start flying around. Once the dust from the explosion settled, Yining saw that the floor had been broken through, as well as the wall to the kitchen. He thought that this was somehow too easy. He crouched down on one knee, whereupon Da-Jai jumped on his back, stroking him and telling him that she had a wonderful daddy and loved him. Yining at this time was trying to catch his breath and regain his breath, for after one use of the ability, he was already exhausted. He looked down thoughtfully, wondering if King Rong had died. A loud scream was heard from the hole, calling Yining by name, after which a red aura rose up, illuminating the entire room. He realized that she wasn't dead yet, which meant he had to run. He grabbed Da-Jai in an armful and ran to the balcony through the window that King Rong had broken earlier. He jumped off the balcony, asking Da-Jai to hold on tightly to him. He realized that he couldn't defeat those who had reincarnated. Yining first landed on the house's visor, after which he jumped onto the sidewalk. After choosing the path, he really became stronger, for he jumped down from the third floor without any problems or difficulties. King Rong went to the balcony and called out his name, saying that he was the future demon king and she was his wife. She claimed that she was telling the truth and asked him to believe her. Yining hugged Da-Jai tightly and ran away, turning around one last time. Yining thought about King Rong trying to deceive him. He had already chosen the divine path. How could he be a demon king? He received a message from Linger who asked if Yining was alive. He replied to her that he was alive and asked her where she was now. Linger replied that she was so happy that Yining was okay. She said she was heading towards Kunlun Mountain and he could find her there. Linger eagerly waited for the myth to appear after 99 days. Attached to the message was a photo file. Standing in the photo was a beautiful young woman with long black hair, red eyes, and a smile on her face. She was wearing a red shirt, black tie, and a white jacket with a leather belt. Yining smiled evilly as he looked at the girl's picture. He was thinking about why girls like to just spread their pictures around like this, since it's so indecent. Da-Jai started to unhappily pinch his cheek, to which Yining told her that it hurt. He paused for a second, after which he thought about what she said the myths would come down. Da-Jai continued to rub the guy's cheeks. He remembered that 3 days ago he was sitting drawing comics in his apartment, sitting in front of huge monitors. Suddenly his phone started vibrating. Someone was calling him. He saw a doggy icon on the screen. He was getting a call from his editor who called him time after time while waiting for a script. Yining with bags under his eyes irritatedly looked at the phone and asked if he didn't have 1 more hour left before turning in the script, and he said his editor liked to rush people too much. He picked up the phone and with a strained friendly face said hello, and told him he would send him his work soon. The editor didn't even listen to him and shouted that he had great news for Yining. He said his comic had been picked up by a publisher, and that could lead to it being adapted into an anime. But he had one request: Yining needs to add some element of mythology to it. Just not like last time where there were all these older sisters, younger sisters, and older ancestors. Yining leaned back in his chair, scratched the back of his head, and said then the comic would just become a chaotic mess. He started twirling the stylus from the graphics tablet in his hand and said he was drawing cultivators, not a mishmash, and wanted freedom for his work. The editor said there would be an additional fee. The price will increase by 15% with each chapter, and the animation copyright will be paid separately. Yining immediately presented a pile of yuan bills around him. He remained silent for a while, then enthusiastically said for that kind of money, he would be willing to start now. Yining reset the ringing on his phone and put it aside. He thought about it and leaned back in his chair. His line of comics is cultivators. Where would he insert an element of mythology? Why wouldn't he change the setting? Not make the main character fall into a crevasse. Send him into a world full of mythical creatures. No, not at all. The plot of the new work is not ready yet. We need to start with the characters. He covered his eyes and began to think about how he could transport the characters to another world. He realized that if he couldn't change the world, he could add different things to their world himself. He began to imagine colorful koi carp swimming through the sea, following a dragon with a blue face. He imagined that the entire planet Earth was surrounded by threads, like a spider web, and a mythical red-faced dragon was headed for it. A notification popped up on his monitor that a new file was being saved called The Descended Myth. Now he was walking down the street with Da Jai, thinking about whether it could be that the new era of their world follows the plot of his comic book. But the main problem was that the plot of the comic book had only been thought up 3 days ago, and he hadn't even started drawing it. Yining ran through the streets while Da Jai held onto his hood and looked around in amazement. He tensed up a bit and started to think that it was strange. After all, if he hadn't drawn the comic book, then the new era of mythos could have been drawn by someone else. He decided to ask Ling about it. After all, she was a fan of his. He texted her and asked how many chapters of his comic she had read, if it had an ending, and if so, what happens there. He looked at the window with their dialogue and kept running forward. Ling replied that his comic never ended because by this time Yining had already died. Guy shockedly read her message, thinking that if he had returned home then, he would have died by now, remembering her previous message. He thought, how could this happen? After all, if he was already dead, then why did King Rong say that he would become a king in the future? Linger's actions seemed strange to him too. After all, if he was already a dead person, then what use would he be in the future? Linger shouldn't have cared about him. Yining ran through the empty streets together with Dasha while a fire was swaying in the background. Yining texted her and asked her why she wanted to save him. He assumed it was just because she was a fan of his. Linger wrote that she was and sent him a thumbs-up sticker. Yining turned onto the bike path while reading their dialogue. Da Jai on his back was not feeling well. The guy asked if Linger was helping him because he was going to be a king in the future. She giggled in response, leaving Yining puzzled. A loud stomach rumbling was heard from Da Jai's side. Yining turned around, looking at her perplexed. Da Jai tearfully said she was hungry and cried loudly. Yining took her in his arms, laughed and said he could order food delivery for her, then remembered that there was no delivery now. With the new era, no matter what happens in the future, they must solve the next problem first, namely food. They heard passers-by shouting about monsters walking around. Yining stopped, listening to the voices. He thought about going to rob a supermarket, but immediately abandoned the idea, as many people would have the same thought. And where there are many people, there must be many monsters. Restaurants and hotels don't suit them. He remembered that he had some noodles at home, but King Rong might still be there. Where should they go to find food? He decided that if he doesn't know where to go, the best way is to go to a bright light. And the best bright light for him right now is the reborn Linger. Linger says that she is now rushing to Kunlun Mountains, but it is in the mountains. The area is wild. And before the new era came, she was at his house. But why didn't she wait for him? Why did she rush to the mountain? He figured she wanted to escape danger that way. Linger knew that after the new era came, the city would fall into chaos, so she left the city before midnight. Yining looked at the devastated, burning city and thought about how he hates these reborns. Yining decided that most likely the city was not safe at all and not suitable for survival. Compared to the city supermarket, the countryside is full of large farms with vegetables. He imagined a farm with a barn with a huge number of greenhouses around it. It had all the same stuff that supermarkets have in their warehouses. The guy looked at the crying girl and told her that he would find her food soon. The girl started wiping her tears and sniffing her nose, agreeing with him. If this era truly had a descended myth in the future, then undoubtedly, the limit of combat capabilities would be greatly increased. He pressed the girl against him and continued walking forward. Once that myth descended into this world, let alone normal people, even a cultivator would not be easy. He imagined a huge monstrous beast that was attacking people. People would not just face some dog-headed monster, rabbit monster, but a mythical monster. He imagined the monster with 12 eyes grabbing the military with its tentacles, breaking their equipment and killing them. This is no longer a normal world setting, a crazy world of myths. The transition period is 99 days. Will the world really become a mythical world in 99 days? Yining thought about how he would survive and how the others would survive. He walked with Da Jai down a small alley, trying to calm her down. Yining found a motorcycle somewhere, put Da Jai on the back seat, and rode with her outside the city. They left the city in search of food. Luckily, he had a spirit fox who was his navigator. Their hair fluttered in the wind as they rode the motorcycle, first to find some fruit to fill their stomachs, and then a small storage area that they wouldn't normally look into. He put Da Jai on his shoulders so she could get her own apples from the trees. They found a cow in the field. Yining killed it using the 100,000 sword technique. Yining stroked the girl's head and said it was meat. The dead cow was lying in front of them. They finally got some food, making themselves a kebab. 3 days later, they were sitting on the roof of an abandoned building. They made a fire there and cooked shish kebab again. Food is becoming scarce, forcing people to risk their lives for food, hence dying. Behind them, 2 monsters with 5 eyes each appeared. They ate Yining and Da Jai. But suddenly there was a green flash and the monsters had paper dolls in their mouths instead. Yining once again used his 100,000 sword skill, thus killing his enemies. Someone below meowed, someone's voice ordering them to attack. Yining saw 4 men trying to kill the cat woman, shouting about being careful with her claws. Yining and Da Jai sat on the monster's corpse, eating their dinner and watching what was happening below. Da Jai waved at them, but they were too busy to notice her. After all that happened, more and more people left the city, otherwise a new life.